Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the New Life Church Rewind podcast. My name is Michael, and I'm here with Pastor David Sangster.
Hey, everybody.
And we are in week 5 of our series called Life of David. And Pastor Dave, what was the name of this week's sermon that we're rewinding today?
A honorable heart.
An honorable heart. And so we're moving quite rapidly through David's life. We're going to spend about 6 weeks, so we're almost done. But let me ask you right off the bat, is there anything you felt like you left out of this week's sermon? Because, we're taking big chunks of David's life, and we're trying to fit it into a 6-week series the best we can.
I think the story that we talked about this week regarding David's relationships with Jonathan and Saul, they actually move forward in his later life to his relationship with his kids. We see that David has a very precarious relationship with what would be the next generation of kings, his own successors, and Absalom and some of his own children. In fact, David, he doesn't really come across as a very good father in many ways. He has some very interesting ways of dealing with his children. So I would have loved to get into the fatherhood portion of David's life, but we just, you have, for a 6-week series, you got to kind of put some things on the cutting room floor. But the fatherhood aspect of David is not something to be emulated. It's more of a cautionary tale.
Right, something to learn from.
Yeah.
And it seems like, just to tag onto that a bit, that in David's interpersonal relationships, sometimes he does behave like you would expect any old king in that region to behave. That really, after you're firstborn, the rest of your children are kind of like your servants, your serfs. They're almost like jewelry or something. They don't really serve a purpose in your life other than to have them.
Yeah, and even as a husband too, with his multiple wives and concubines and things like that. There's a lot to be. Yeah.
Let's put it this way: a lot of drama.
Yeah.
So
Kardashian type.
Let's talk about another one of David's relationships.
Okay.
So this week really centered on David's relationship with his best friend named Jonathan. And Jonathan was, I guess you'd call him the Prince of Israel. He was Saul's firstborn. And I remember a long time ago when I was first getting to know you, we had coffee, and I was telling you how one thing I've always been blessed with, I had all these amazing male friendships that I had. And I said, you don't ever hear enough about Jonathan and David. And then you said something that just blew my mind. You told me how a long time ago when you were in Bible college.
Well, it wasn't that long ago.
Well, whatever. Long enough ago.
Yeah, right.
That there was like some people would talk under their breath that Jonathan and David were, let's put it this way, more than just friends. And I couldn't believe that reading the text, because when I read that story, I was like, that's how I feel about my close male friends.
Right.
And so I'm just going to ask you straight out, for the record, were David and Jonathan gay?
That's the question around this story. And we just didn't deal with it on Sunday. I thought it would be a better opportunity to deal with it here, because this is one of the major stories in Scripture that the LGBTQ community use to support homosexual marriage in our culture today.
Because I'm just going to read you a couple of statements. The Bible says, David states that Jonathan's love was, quote, more wonderful than the love of a woman.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's 2 Samuel. Jonathan also loved David, and he kissed him. The text even tells us that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And I guess in today's world, two guys talking about each other like that, this kind of reads to the modern person a little romantic.
Yeah. And I think that's the problem. We'll just talk about that for a couple of seconds. But you have to remember that David and Jonathan, like we talked about last week, the Old Testament was written to a different culture than ours. And even cultures today in the Near East have different ways to men relate to one another.
Sure.
Like you find some people still hold hands in the Near East. Men hold hands in the streets, things like
Yes.
that. Greeting somebody with a kiss is not out of the question in many even European countries.
Right.
So anyway, but here's some things to think about. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, we see that David had multiple wives and concubines. I mean, he was obviously attracted towards women. He lusted, we talked about this last week, he lusted after a naked woman, Bathsheba, to the point of committing adultery with her.
Yeah, if David had any flaws, it seems as though he liked the women too much.
Exactly. And then Jonathan was married too. He had a wife. It doesn't really fit the narrative that David and Jonathan were attracted to each other, not in a sexual way.
Right. And I want to tell the listeners, we're not actually trying to make light out of this.
No.
This is something that is
out
currently
there.
being taught from some pulpits and some seminaries, that this is a way that we can try to read something we want in our culture into the Bible, as opposed to reading it in its proper context.
Yeah. So in 1 Samuel 18, where Jonathan loved David, I mean, the Hebrew on that for love is not the erotic love of marriage. That word is translated, the erotic love of marriage is translated always yod.
Yod.
Yeah, or yad. Mm-hmm. And then the love that is in this particular passage is ahib, and that's a same-sex respect and friendship type of love. So even if you look deeper into the etymology of the words, you're going to see a non-sexual relationship here. And there's other places where that comes, into play. And I think it's really a stretch if you look at the text for what it is and not what you want it to be, to say that these two guys had a sexual relationship. And it also, I think it really takes away from what the relationship actually was. Right. I mean, this is an amazing relationship that should be emulated by men, not, shunned. And I think that's done a lot of damage to men over the years, because they don't even want to come near these verses, because they don't want to, associate with something that would be, homosexual in nature. And that's a shame. So
for the people who are reading this relationship as being more than just dear friends, does that say something about our culture today, that anyone could read this and think, oh yeah, these two guys, like, they're definitely dating or whatever. Like, this is more than just friends. Or maybe they're closeted, but they really love each other like that.
Right.
Does that say something about us today?
Yeah. I mean, think about a Rorschach test, revealing the inner thoughts rather than the objective truth, right? This concept of we're so saturated with love being equated with sexual activity. I mean, love equals sex in our culture. And that's just a shame. Not long ago, this wasn't the case. I mean, I think about some relationships that were big even in our own American history, that men could enjoy being with other men and strengthen one another and just have a really strong bond without it having to overflow into this kind of degraded discourse on sexuality.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You also talked about in this sermon that you've had many memorable relationships in your life and in your ministry, and how these kinds of relationships, like the one we see between Jonathan and David. So how have they helped you, like relationships like that? Would you like to talk about one that sticks out to you, or one that's really helped you in your life, your ministry, being a dad, etc.?
Yeah, I mentioned on Sunday that I've always been in pursuit of mentorship type relationships. But that's something that you have to really go out and find. A lot of times the best ones are ones that find you, right? You have a relationship with somebody as in your youth, and you grow up with those people, and you've done things together. You've played sports together, or for guys, I don't know how women connect. I'm a dude, so you connect over a common thing, right? And so one of the biggest mentors of my life and friends today at this time was my youth pastor, Frank Canador. He's now lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, but even today we will connect over the phone, and he was just always there to sharpen. And so, when you build these types of relationships, you have to make yourself vulnerable enough to be able to take criticism from these relationships. And He was older than I was. He's my youth pastor. So, he encouraged me. He challenged me. He was one of my coaches, so he inspired me. And ultimately, he is the one who helped me down the path towards realizing my call to pastor. And he's one. He's one that will always be on the top of my list of people who, when we had a tragedy in our budding family, he was the first call. He was the first call. But more recently, I have friends that I've come into contact with that work in the Southern New England Ministry Network that, man, they are just brothers in arms, and if they need something, I'm there for them. If I need something, they're there for me. And those are not even family. I mean, my greatest mentor of all time, obviously, was, I shouldn't say obviously, but was my dad.
Okay.
And his loss left quite a big vacuum. And and I enjoy our relationship, you and I. I mean, I feel like that's one of those relationships.
Yeah, I'll talk briefly about it. As far as my life in ministry, I say this with due respect, but we have this idea of like someone being a father to you in the faith, and your mentorship to me has been immense. And, I guess we'll just say this on the internet now. I'm very grateful for everything that you've done for me, and you've shown me. And I'll say we're going to talk a little bit about mentorship, I think, later on. But one quality from you that I appreciate was I think you've always given me enough room to make my own mistakes. Mm-hmm. You're like, I'll tell you about my mistakes, kind of go out and make your own mistakes, mm-hmm. and you'll figure it out. And one more briefly, I have a friend mm-hmm. who, when I read about this, relationship between Jonathan and David, someone who's not actually one of my brothers, mm-hmm. but, probably is just as close to me to any human being on this planet besides my wife. And so Aaron, if you're listening, that's my friend. I have a friend named Aaron, and he's, mm-hmm. I think you said like your first call or whatever.
Yeah.
And I know that no judgment.
Right.
Maybe down the line, he's never been afraid to correct me, but not in the moment. And I think some of us are blessed with those friendships and some of us are seeking them out. Mm-hmm. But that's really what we can learn from this story, that to have a friend like Jonathan mm-hmm. is in some ways something that can make you wealthy without actually having money in the bank.
Right.
And they're just so important.
And I think it's one of those things that if you don't have it, it's so worth your while to pursue it, because there's nothing can substitute somebody having your back, someone, like we said on Sunday, somebody having your back, somebody willing to sit with you and cry with you, and somebody who's going to encourage you in your faith.
And we see that this friendship between Jonathan and David, it doesn't just affect those two, right? It spills over into mm-hmm. the people around them. And we read from the story that there's this character, so it's Jonathan's son, right. Mephibosheth, is that how you say it? And is that his firstborn, or do we get a sense of that from the text? Or
I don't know that it probably does say, but I can't tell you at the top.
But he's recognized as the heir apparent. The heir apparent.
Yeah.
So wherever he lies there, and we see that David's love and respect for Jonathan mm-hmm. transcends even to the next generation.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you about that. Is David's respect in the kindness he shows Mephibosheth, if you go back and listen to the sermon, that kindness that he shows him, is that just out of respect for Jonathan, do you think? Or is that a little bit of David's, at times, noble character creeping in, and David saying, like, I have so much respect for the office of king, that because the way he treated Saul, mm-hmm. is that there too, or does he act that way just because of his love for Jonathan? Or do you think...
I don't think there's any way to know for sure. The only one we know for sure is that he made a covenant with Jonathan, right? But if you go back to the times when when David spared Saul's life, there was no reason to do that other than honor for the position of king, for the crown, right? So he may be thinking like he did there, I need to set an example because one day I'm going to be dead and my kids are going to inherit the crown. And if I don't set a good example of treating the lineage well, then there could be problems for my own family down the road.
Right, and maybe David has a little bit of that, we're going to do things different here.
Right.
These other kings and these other places, they're going to do that genocide thing. But here in Israel, we're special. We're going to be different. The least I can do is try to walk in that a little bit.
And it's not a simple thing. I mean, the succession plan of kingship is pretty solid. So for him to be put in as king, to be anointed as king outside of the family, outside of the lineage of Saul, is a big deal. And this, if you went down a straight pagan practice of what you do, it would be to kill off the previous king's heirs. Mm-hmm. And David doesn't do this, and it does bite him later on. Mephibosheth actually does a campaign to get the king, to pull the kingship away from David later on in his life. And David still, even though he does punish him, he still doesn't kill him. It's an amazing story that David holds his hand. And I really do believe. Now, my thought is this. There would be no other, because he actually has a legitimate reason to now, because Mephibosheth has subverted him, right, to kill him. That's how much he loved Jonathan. He was willing to take the bumps and the bruises of this political intrigue because of his love for his friend.
And I just can't help but think about this, what we talked about last week a bit. We already know David believes that he'll see his deceased son again. Right. He probably in the same way understands that he would like to see his friend Jonathan again someday. And what an awkward, meeting in heaven that may be when he said, I made this covenant with you, and then once you were gone. And I just think that does speak so much about their relationship.
That's cool.
And we talked a lot about isolation on Sunday.
Yeah.
So let's spend a bit of time here on the podcast talking about isolation. So can you tell us a bit more about how as modern people, we are more isolated than ever? Because it seems like a weird concept, and we talked about it a bit, but how is that so?
The interesting thing about it is that we're more connected than we ever have been before in history of the world through our technology and our media. Mm-hmm. Yet the feeling of isolation is at an all-time high. I think especially we felt it during COVID. I mean, people were just, the suicide rates were intense because people were just so disconnected from real human relationships. The isolation that we feel now is not isolation of conversation or of stimulation. It's an isolation of the real. That's my statement. It's an isolation of the real. We don't date normal anymore.
Right.
Instead of going somewhere and finding someone that you want to ask out, how do we do it? We look at pictures on a app,
right,
and we select like we would out of a catalog, and then hope it works out. It's just not real. It's not organic. It's not authentic. So it's hard for young people. And I'm not saying that I have the answer for that the whole way through. I think it's a really precarious time for young people, especially who have been brought up under this culture and really don't know what the real was back then. This is real for them, but it's lacking a level of flesh and blood and authenticity, and it's hard.
And speaking of children too, and young adults, and I'll say this: like, I'm 37. I felt like I was a child till about 5 years ago, right? So people 30 and under, information now travels so fast, but it hits our brains at such a speed and such a rapid pace that I don't think young people have had enough life experience to be able to start discerning it at the rate that they receive it. And it makes me wonder if that has something to do with this isolation too, that there's so many opinions, so many thoughts, so many sides to choose from, so many products, that it almost gives you like a tunnel vision.
Oh, absolutely.
That you you can't see it all, so you only lock in and you focus. And I think that's isolating too, the speed of the technology that we have.
And the way it's coming to you is coming to you as an individual, not as a community. So how are you processing the information that's coming? You're not. You're just mulling it over in your own head. You're not bouncing it off of somebody. You're not getting other people's opinions. You're just getting what's coming to you, and you're having the entire burden of processing that information. And then because of, and I'm not anti-technology, but
we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah, but because of the algorithms that are in place, there tends to be this, echo chambers that get built. And then you start believing everybody believes this.
Yeah.
When it's not true, because you're not actually talking to real people. You're just getting inundated with media and content.
And I'll tell you a story. Just the other day, I was on vacation.
Yeah.
And I was with my in-laws, my wife. And so there's 4 of us in a room. And it was a rainy vacation day. So we were kind of stuck in the house. Now, we're all in the same room together. And then my mother-in-law says, look at the typical American family. You're on your phone. You're on your phone. You're on your phone. So even though we're spending time together, we're actually still isolated, because it wasn't like the old days where if we were all watching the same thing on television, even that,
right,
we could process it together.
Right.
But now
you're in a digital room.
We're almost in our own little digital pod, even though, and we're not actually spending time together. And then we laughed about it.
Yeah.
And then we all put our phones down. Then we caught her on her phone and we teased her. But we're all guilty of it. Even though we're connected, we're isolated. It's a very strange thing.
I've said it, in sermons before. Lisa and I constantly marvel at the fact that you'll have a whole family, and they go out to a nice restaurant, and they're paying money to sit around a table and eat food that they didn't prepare themselves, and they're all on their phones. So they're in separate rooms, paying money to be around the same table. Not real rooms, digital rooms. And so what you said is very important. You said you laughed about it, and then you tried to, that intentionality has got to be applied toward our digital culture. So when we say to people, you need to find a mentor, it means you have to put the phone down, go get a cup of coffee with someone and have a real conversation. And it's not something that's natural to us, especially the younger generation. It's something that has to be done intentionally.
Right. And so just a bit about this technology. So this technology that we've created, this interconnectivity but it's isolating at the same time, is the technology a tool that we haven't figured out how to use properly? Like, someday we'll laugh about the days when we thought the speed of information, the connectivity was a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. Or is it really just a Tower of Babel all over again? Like, it is a way for us we think if we master this technology, it's almost like this first step to telepathy, and then the next step to being like gods. The information can be implanted in your brain. You're all knowing. Which one is it? Is it a little of both? I've tossed this around in my head. I'm starting to wonder if, God needs to come down and take a look at what we're up to again and scatter us from this technology, as much as I love it.
Yeah.
Because I'm a
I think it's
creature
both. I think it's both. I think it could go both ways. I think, think about 20 years ago. You go into a restaurant and people would be smoking all over the place.
I even remember that.
Right?
It's not that long ago.
But now, in America at least, I mean, there's no smoking sections. The irony of a smoking section, right? It's not even blocked off by any walls. It's just one over there, one over here. But you can't smoke in a restaurant anymore. And the warnings on that are, and you see somebody smoking, you're thinking, oh, they have an addiction. That's the thought I have. Oh, it's not something that we're like, oh, that's so cool anymore. That used to be the way it was thought. Movie stars would have a cigarette, and it would be a sign of being cool or being sophisticated.
Just the other day, I saw a television show come on, and it said, rated whatever age for historical smoking.
Yeah, yeah.
That we don't even want kids to see a character they may like on TV smoking anymore, because we've learned that
not good for you.
At least habitual smoking is not good for you.
So we could either go one of two ways. We could just really double down on this technology and, do the whole implants But my hope is that we will, because we don't have the data, we're the first generation. Our kids really are the first generation to grow up with this type of interconnectivity.
Right. They don't know a world without cell phones
they're
and
guinea
high
pigs.
speed. Right.
They're guinea pigs, and it's unfortunate to say it that way, but they are. So hopefully, data will be gained. Mm-hmm. We're already seeing it, that they're saying children who sit in front of screens for a certain amount of time of day, their brain function is actually suffering for it. So I think my hope is this: that we'll wise up, we'll see it as a tool to be used, and but there is a potential for it to be abused and hurt us. And then you'll have warnings, like you do on a pack of cigarettes, with phones and digital time.
Could you imagine if you have to, when you open up Instagram,
yeah,
it asks you for your driver's license number or something because it wants to verify that you're not of the age where this could be dangerous for you. That could be the future.
So we'll see.
So why is isolation so dangerous for Christian people? I mean, all people, but particularly Christian people.
I think isolation is particularly, this is why we have the church. Jesus, God, in all of his wisdom, said, you need an entity that is going to help you in this life because you have a huge target on your back. Mm-hmm. The enemy wants to take you out, and the best way to take you out is to remove your support. So I think amongst Christians, because we are counter the culture of the prince of the power of the air,
right?
We tend to have more of a target on our back, and we can't do this alone. We are going to struggle. David had his worst moments in his history when he removed himself from his accountability structures.
That's true. And this is always the danger of any leader, anybody in power.
Right.
Because by nature of anything that's kind of shaped like a pyramid scheme or organizational chart or whatever,
right,
the higher up on it you get, the less things are next to you and the more isolated you become.
It's lonely on the top.
And so I want to read a verse and then we're going to talk about it for just a minute. 1 Peter 5 verse 8, it says, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Now, if you've ever seen one of those nature documentaries and they show the lion hunting its prey, the first thing it does typically is to isolate one from the pack.
Right.
And is that really the image that we're supposed to get here? That our enemy literally wants to separate us so that it can eat us.
Yeah, I
alive.
Actually showed, in dealing with this topic in a previous sermon series a while back, I showed a video of a lion hunting a wildebeest. And it's interesting. The lion strategically tried to separate one of the weakest of the herd and get them away from the strong ones so that it would be an easier target. Now, the cool thing about the video I showed is that it showed this herd of wildebeests pouring over a hill and like attacking the lion, but they wouldn't do that alone. They did it as a herd, and they actually saved the weaker one. I think it was a youngling. They saved it because they came at it as a herd, not as individuals. So yes, absolutely. This is what 1 Peter is talking about. This concept of trying to isolate people, especially when they're down. One of the weirdest things that happens in church culture is that when somebody goes through a difficult time, they're depressed or they have a life experience that is rough, instead of coming to the church, they often isolate. And it's a constant battle from a pastoral standpoint to keep tabs on people who may have kind of wandered away or they're coming off the attendance list quite a bit. It's a red flag for us as pastors to say that person needs a call because something's going on there, because isolation usually happens when you're at your weakest. And that's where the enemy is at its most potent.
Yeah, and in human body language, I don't know about wildebeest, but human body language, I don't know if wildebeest have body language, but the human body language is you're going through something, you're down, the shoulders drop.
Yeah.
the people's gaze drops to the floor. They look down and away from people. And that is the perfect time to be attacked by an ambush predator.
Absolutely.
When you're down and you're just walking through life looking at the floor. And that's people's body language gets, not just their everything about them kind of gets depressive. And what a perfect opportunity for one of these ambush predators to, because that's really what the lion is. They're actually not as courageous as we make them out to be, right? They prowl, they stalk, and then they only exert energy for a brief amount of time, and it overwhelms you.
But it's intense. I mean, that brings me back to the story of Cain and Abel. When Cain's sacrifice was not accepted by God, he got bitter, and he had a moment. And God came to him and said, Cain, why is your countenance fallen? He said, be careful, because the enemy is crouching on your doorstep to devour you. And that what you just said just brought that to my mind, this countenance falling, this vulnerable point where if you don't master it, and that's what he said to Cain, you must master it. And if you don't master it, but how do you do that on your own?
And so this is where we see the mission of the church,
right?
That it's not just pastors and leaders, but
brothers and sisters.
So this is kind of the last topic, and it ties right in. You said, have someone in your life to call out of you what God has already placed in you, or something like that.
You got
Maybe the direct quote. And so peak church culture, so it seems, is if everyone in the church has a mentor and what would you call it, a mentee? A mentee.
Yep.
If everyone has one, that's the peak flow. So
great.
If someone's pouring into you, you're then pouring into someone else. But if everyone has one of those relationships, when someone's countenance is low, someone is going to notice.
Yep, someone will notice.
Someone will.
Yeah.
And that's when we can come around each other as the body of Christ and say, we say, not today, Satan, not today, lion.
Right.
You're not ambushing one of our own today.
Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. And that, what I would call that right there, Michael, is church.
Right.
Church is not a 15, 20-minute, half an hour worship service on a Sunday morning followed by a sermon. That's not church. That is the celebration of the saints.
Yes.
Church is this interconnected support system where the body functions at its optimal levels, because everything is interconnected and looking out for one another. And if we're not doing that as a church, then I don't think we're fulfilling the purpose for which God ordained the church to exist. So it's always it's a difficult thing to figure out how to make that happen and how to get that running on all cylinders. But that's what the church is supposed to be. And that's really what we want at New Life. We're not perfect at it, but that's what we want.
And so one last thing. By the time I kind of got involved in church, people kind of stopped calling each other brother and sister.
Yeah.
And then
sister so-and-so, brother so-and-so.
And then it kind of became like a joke. Not a joke, but it was almost like a caricature of like big evangelical culture in America or whatever. So, but I'll be honest with you, I'm sad that I missed it. Because I think whether we come up with a new word or not, but a word that has that value that when we say at church, hey, Brother Dave, Sister Ariel, whatever,
right?
That it's not just it's more right. It actually means something. It means you're part of the herd, and I wish we family, and I wish we could get back to finding a way to communicate not just to ourselves but to the culture,
right?
That we're different because God has set us apart as different. That we are brothers and sisters, and it just makes me think about all this stuff that you talked about with Jonathan and David. They were, because we're all born again into a new family. Right. So we literally, it's not a figure of speech. We literally are brothers and sisters. And I just for me, I missed that. I think we should bring it back.
Well, I think it's, because it became cliche, it kind of lost its potency. But if I even say, when I'm praying at the beginning of a service, Lord, be with my brothers and sisters today. We need to identify as the family that God made us to be. And I'll just leave you with one last verse, because this is so important towards this connectivity. And we use it on Sunday. I just want to read it again. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 4. It says, 2 are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift him up. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has no one to lift him up. Again, if two lie down together, they keep each other warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. And that's what the church needs.
Right, and we know God himself is a relationship.
Absolutely.
He is a
three-banded cord.
A three-banded cord. So that is just, it is hardwired into our DNA. And that's why we need the church so badly. So I think that's it for this week. Please join us next week as we wrap up our series on the story of David. And I hope that this has been a blessing to you. I know it's been a blessing to Pastor and myself. So if you enjoyed your time with us, please remember to like, follow, subscribe, give us that 5-star review. If you didn't like it, we're not asking you to lie, but don't give us a 1-star because we think that this podcast can have some outreach and some evangelistic opportunities. So please just remember to do that for us. And we thank you, and we'll see you next week.
God bless.
Matthew 28.